It's a safe bet that almost no one involved in the war now ongoing in Iran and the Gulf would like to see it continue much longer. If you were to poll, well, the Iranians or the Americans, basically anybody, how long do you want this to go? Very few people would say, I want it to go a long time. But that doesn't mean it won't go a long time. Unfortunately, it is likely to. It's unlikely to be resolved anytime soon. Of course, that could prove to be untrue. You never know. It's an utterly dynamic situation. But big picture, there are still a couple of unresolved questions that this war may resolve. This war may be the only thing that resolves them. And so until there's a consensus on the answers to those questions, it probably is going to continue. What are those questions? Well, the first is geopolitical, and it's the biggest question of all, which is who runs the world? Who gets to make the decisions? Not simply who's richest, but who makes the rules, who sets the terms. And for most of our lifetimes, there has been no question about that. The answer has been the United States. The United States sets the rules. The United States runs the world. That's been true in the western half of the world since 1945, when the U.S. emerged stronger and richer than any other nation after the end of World War II. And it's been true since August of 1991, 35 years ago, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The United States has reigned in a unipolar world. That's what they call it. There's just one pole. There's one center of gravity. There's one power center, and that's been the United States. But that has changed over the past several years, maybe decades, certainly since China was admitted into the WTO in 2001. Now it is a multipolar world. You've heard that phrase, no doubt, and that means there are at least a couple centers of gravity. Really, there are two. There's the U.S. and the constellation of states with which it's allied, and then there is, on the eastern hemisphere of the globe, China. And China is now a peer with the United States, at least, almost no matter how you measure it. Population, of course, much bigger. Military power, well, we're not quite sure, but certainly from a technological and industrial output standpoint, at least a peer. And then on a pure economic level, well, China has a bigger economy, a bigger real economy than the United States. So yes, China is a peer. And so the question is, since you now have two countries that are roughly evenly matched, we never do know until they come into conflict, but they seem roughly evenly matched, who gets to set the terms for commerce and diplomacy and everything else that happens on the globe? Well, if you were to reach a diplomatic solution, there would be, in effect, a power sharing agreement between these two countries. You take the East, I take the West. Here are the terms. But unfortunately, no such agreement, formal or informal, has been reached for a bunch of reasons. It's everybody's fault. But one of the reasons is almost nobody in Washington can get his head around the current, present, obvious reality, which is, no, we don't run everything anymore. We are in competition, not necessarily in conflict, but in competition with this other country that's at least as powerful as we are, called China, different system, language, culture, etc., but at least every bit as powerful. And so you can't make unilateral decisions anymore. It's sort of that moment that many parents face when used to barking orders at their kids, they realize the kid is taller than them, and like it's a new relationship in some ways. You're always the parent, but you can't just bark orders anymore. That's pretty much where we are with China, or maybe a little past that, actually. And what we've noticed over the past several years is the total unwillingness, the inflexibility of Washington policymakers to just acknowledge the reality. And instead, even as we speak, there's probably some symposium underway in Washington about what will we do if China invades Taiwan. Well, of course, from China's perspective, Taiwan is part of China. It's just sort of run off for the past 75 years, but it's still part of China. That's their view. And the United States, of course, isn't in a position to stop the reclamation of Taiwan. Let's stop lying. And yet only in D.C. is that not obvious, which is to say people in Washington are still acting like they're running everything unopposed, but they're not. And the rest of the world is looking on and thinking at some point, you got to knock it off and face reality. Now, there are a lot of people in the United States, me included, who would like to live in a unipolar world. It's way less fun to be constrained, to have to come to terms with another country before you make a decision. No one wants to do that. No one wants to be challenged. But again, it's sort of not up to us or anyone the moment that you live in. You're not in charge of reality, actually. And so this is the reality we live in. And the question is, are we going to come to terms with it in a reasonable way, or are we going to be forced through use of arms to face that reality. And it looks increasingly like the latter. Unfortunately, that is not the way to settle matters like this, because you can emerge greatly diminished from those contests and find yourself in a much weaker negotiating position. Better negotiate while you're strong than when you're weak. But our leaders weren't wise or farsighted enough to do that. Seized by hubris, they were dictating terms, like Baghdad Bob, It's sad, actually. No reason to laugh about it. But that is one of the questions now being decided in Iran. Why Iran? Well, because these questions are always decided by proxy. No two great powers want to go to war with each other, of course, especially in the nuclear age, because that could mean simultaneous elimination, and no one wants that, at least consciously. And so typically these things play out in third countries, like Vietnam famously, or Afghanistan for both the Soviets and the United States, or Korea, and now Iran. Iran, which is part of an alliance that includes the other big powers, Russia and China. So they may not be explicitly weighing in, which is to say they're not fighting alongside the Iranians yet, but they're certainly on Iran's side, and they're certainly helping in a multitude of ways, one expects. And a lot for them rides on the outcome. And because it does, it makes it harder to settle this thing. So that's the geopolitical, very obvious overlay here. That's why this is not just a debate about whether the Ayatollah has nuclear weapons. Stop. It's much bigger than that and much more serious than that. And the consequences are much more profound than that. So that's the first. But there is another layer that most Americans are not aware of, but much of the rest of the world is highly aware of. And that is a religious layer. Now, Lindsey Graham is on tape saying to a gaggle of reporters, his bloodshot eyes, his puffy face, God knows what he's been doing, saying explicitly, this is a religious war. This is a religious war. Now, his motive in saying that, he's not here to answer the question. We can only guess. Is he trying to foment a religious war? Probably. He's an end times kind of guy. But it almost doesn't matter. He's telling the truth for once. This is a religious war, fundamentally. And that is not obvious to most Americans because this is the most secular society, not just the United States, but the West, the English-speaking world, Europe and the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand. In history, there's never been a more godless, to be blunt about it, a more secular society at scale. Never. Nothing approaching this has ever happened, ever. Every society is fundamentally a religious society, explicitly religious except ours. So we lack the terms to describe what we're seeing, and we lack the imagination to think about it. And, well, to quote Jesus, we have the eyes, but we cannot see. We don't see what's happening around us, but the rest of the world very much does see. So you often hear people talk about the Middle East crisis, and they usually mean energy. People want the oil, the gas. But traditionally, when people have talked about the Middle East, they're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about the holiest spot on earth. Let's be a lot more specific when we say the holiest spot on earth. The holiest spot on earth is something called the foundation stone. The foundation stone is literally a rock in Jerusalem, on what used to be called Mount Moriah, which was at one point the highest place in the oldest part of Jerusalem. And it's on that spot, on that rock, on that stone, that Jews believe the world began, that the Old Testament, or the Jewish Torah, tells us that Abraham brought Isaac bound to be sacrificed to God. It's on that spot that Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. And of course, it's right nearby that Christians believe Jesus was crucified and then rose to heaven. So on that spot, or right nearby, a lot has happened. But critically on that spot, because it was the place where Abraham brought Isaac, and again, to American ears, this sounds weird, but to the rest of the world, it's like, yeah, everyone knows this because it's the center of their lives. On that spot, Solomon built his famous temple. Now, in the Torah, it says pretty clearly, and correct me if I'm misreading it, that Jews, followers of God, can only publicly worship God and sacrifice on that spot, in that city, Jerusalem, on that spot. And on that spot was built a temple, the first temple. And that was destroyed by the Babylonians, famously. And then it was rebuilt and later improved by Herod. And it was, at its completion, I think, the largest building, certainly the largest religious building in the ancient world. And it was in that building that Jesus preached, in what we call the Second Temple that Jesus preached, the very center of Judaism, building without which you can't really have Torah Judaism. The religion just sort of didn't work without it. By its own terms, in its own book, it said that. And during one of his sermons, in that sermon, Jesus, who Christians believe is God sent to earth, says, this will be torn down. Not one stone will be left standing. And it was shortly after that that he was put on trial in the middle of the night and tortured to death, crucified. As it happened, so that's the religion. Here's the history. About 35 years later, 37 years later, in that range, in 70 AD, Titus, the emperor of the Roman Empire, got into quite a conflict with the Jews of Judea and Jerusalem. And it's complex and incredibly brutal, but the bottom line was, in AD 70, the Romans besieged Jerusalem, finally broke through the walls, and tore that temple stone from stone, not a single stone left upon another. Really a kind of dedication to destruction that's hard for the modern mind to imagine. We talk about genocide this, genocide that. The Romans tried to genocide the Jews for real. And they succeeded in destroying the temple. And with it, Temple Judaism, Torah Judaism. You can't have the religion that existed before AD 70, after AD 70, because there's no temple. And so this has been an open wound for 2,000 years, and certainly understandably, people have wanted to rebuild the temple, to build what they call the third temple, to reestablish this religion at its birthplace. There are a couple problems with this. One, exactly 500 years after Titus destroyed the temple in AD 70, in AD 570, a man called Muhammad was born in Mecca and built one of the world's great religions, the world's second largest religion, as it stands today, in a very short period. His name was Muhammad. He was born in Mecca. He died in nearby Medina. But in the meantime, he built, or inspired the building of, within 50 years of his death, one of the great religious monuments in the world, certainly one of the prettiest, called the Dome of the Rock. And it's in Jerusalem on Moriah, in fact, built over the foundation stone. And if you've ever been to Jerusalem, or if you've ever seen photographs of it, you will remember vividly a gold dome. It's called the Dome of the Rock. Why is it called that? Because there's a rock underneath it, the foundation stone, that is built on the site of the Second Temple. And that's in what's known as the Al-Aqsa complex. There's a mosque next door called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that spot is one of three holy places, apparently co-equal holy places, in Islam: Mecca, Medina, Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa. So that is at the very center of Judaism. I mean, physically the center of Judaism, that spot, that exact spot over the foundation stone, and Islam. And it has been occupied by a mosque. A mosque has been sitting there since the 7th century, since the late 600s. Amazing. You may be dimly aware of this. Now, why go on at length about this? Because now is the moment, right now, like this week, is the moment that some people, not a huge number, most people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, are not fully aware of all this, but some people are highly aware of it and would like to begin the process of tearing down the Dome of the Rock, tearing down Al-Aqsa Mosque, and rebuilding the Third Temple. Now, there are a lot of things to say about this, about its likelihood, the potential effects of it. But first, just a quick side note on the theology of this from a Christian point of view. Now, it was Jesus who said this temple will be torn down, shocking everyone around him. If it's in the Gospels, it's in at least a couple of the Gospels. And the people who heard it just couldn't believe it. And of course, the people running the temple, the Pharisees and Sadducees, were gravely offended by it. Why wouldn't they be? But then it happened. less than 40 years later, it actually happened. He was right. He called it. And so from a Christian perspective, he did that. God called for the destruction of the temple. And as Jesus says plainly in the Gospels, I'm the temple. I'm the temple now. The temple will be rebuilt after 3 days. When I'm resurrected, I am the new temple. Says that. But there has been at least one attempt in the last 2,000 years to rebuild a physical third temple. And it happened in the 4th century. And it happened, without getting too far afield, shortly after the death of Constantine. Now, Constantine was the 4th century Roman emperor who converted to Christianity and very famously turned the Roman Empire Christian, thereby spreading Christianity basically instantly across the West, where it's remained, more or less, ever since. That was in the 300s, the 4th century. Now, his nephew became emperor.